Hey everyone. All right, our topic this week is on gender equity laws. And before we get into the specific gender equity laws we're going to be examining through the module this week, I do want to mention, and I just think it's important since we've been looking at this topic of constitutional law for the past few weeks, that it's important that we now leave that sort of framework behind. Every case we've been examining over the past few weeks has involved this question of state action and whether or not an organization was a state actor, and that was an important determinant in deciding whether or not we could pursue a lawsuit under the Constitution. And I just want to make it clear that that no longer applies here to these gender equity laws we're going to be looking at here this week. These laws are actually centered in statutory law. So these are laws that are passed by legislative bodies at the federal level. So those same kind of concepts and frameworks that we discussed in the context of constitutional law will no longer apply. Okay. So before we get into looking at the specific legal issues this week, I always like to start off by just looking at some terminology and clarifying a few things. You probably noted on the first slide and in your module that I use this term gender equity instead of gender equality in our notes, okay? And there's a specific reason for that, and I think it's important that we have this sort of foundation before we move forward and look at the laws that we're going to look at. So let's just look at the difference between equality and equity from a definition standpoint. And you have this visual here that I think might help. So this idea of equality, by definition, is the state of equal access to resources and opportunities, right? So this idea that we treat everyone the same without regard for differences. So you can see in the visual here, this is providing everyone with the same size block, right, in order to see the game. But we can also see in this picture that there's a problem, right, in terms of different heights, right? So this idea of equality doesn't account for these differences. That's where this concept of equity comes in and why I think it's a better term to describe what it is these laws are actually doing. So this idea of gender equity actually takes into account differences and basically provides people with what they need in order to be successful. And it's a recognition that certain people might have different requirements based on their place in the world, and that not everyone has the same level of privilege as their fellow citizens. So in regards to gender, keep in mind that we don't all come into society with the same protections and privileges. So when we talk about gender and the laws specific to gender equity, we're talking about laws that work specifically to fight against discrimination based on gender. And in this case, gender that has historically been underrepresented in our society. And we have a ton of historical data to show that women in this country have, historically been the underrepresented group. So just keep in mind that the laws that we look at, specifically Title IX and the Equal Pay Act, are a form of gender equity, right? They're acknowledging that there are gaps, that there are differences that have led to women having less of an opportunity historically, and therefore these laws are in place to try to close that gap, right? To try to create opportunity for women, the underrepresented sex in our society. So again, the idea of equity here is in this visual, that instead of providing everyone with the same size box, we provide different size boxes in order to make sure everyone can see the game. And that's really the heart of what we're talking about here this week in our unit on gender equity. Okay, so we're going to start by focusing on Title IX, and hopefully you had a chance to review that short video I shared in your module. That gives a little bit of historical context for what this law is and the time that it was enacted. But very briefly, just to highlight a few important things here from an administrative perspective, this is a law that was passed as part of an existing law. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in the semester, was passed in 1964, and Title IX was part of several amendments to that act in 1972. And it's actually a very short amendment. You can see the verbiage right here on your slide. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. That's it. That's Title IX, at least in its original form as part of the Civil Rights Act. And so a question I often get from students is, well, when we think of Title IX, all we think about is athletics. And that's probably because for the most part in our history, when Title IX is reported on, it's reported on in the context of athletics. But the true origination of the law had nothing to do with athletics, or at least it wasn't mentioned in the verbiage, right? You don't see any mention of athletics or sport here. What the issue was at the time is that there was still a lot of discrimination based on sex in education programs across the country, meaning that it was still possible at this time for a woman to apply for a college and for the college to send back her application and say, women need not apply, that they weren't considering women at the time. So there was a very real and deep level of discrimination that existed in our education programs that required a law like this in order to make it illegal for those education programs to discriminate based on sex. Now, as the law is being put together and phrased, the writers of it recognized that it would also have an impact on athletics. But I don't think that the country realized the true impact of it at the time. You also have to keep in mind the kind of the historical context of this time period. This is right after the 1960s. There is this great sort of equality movement happening in the country for more women's rights, kind of in conjunction with this racial movement against discrimination. So there's really this push for equity and equality in this country. And at the same time, you have a really interesting thing happening in the sports world. You have Billie Jean King, who was a very famous tennis player for women at the time, who had ultimately challenged Bobby Riggs, who was a former men's pro, to a match. And if you've not seen the movie Battle of the Sexes, I really encourage you to watch it. And obviously it's a dramatization of that match, but that particular match, this woman playing a man for the first time on national television, was really meaningful, and she ultimately ended up beating him. And that, coupled with sort of the movement that's happening at the time for equality, the marches that are happening, sort of the changes that are occurring in the country, kind of all happen in preparation for this law being passed. And that gives you a little bit of historical context for why it was passed. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the scope of Title IX. I already said before, kind of what we know about constitutional law is not going to apply, but we do have some more sort of framework, a different framework that we need to consider in terms of who is actually covered, or who has to comply with Title IX. So you can see here that the only type of discrimination covered under Title IX is, in fact, gender discrimination, right? And that's pretty self-evident by reading the law itself. We also know, based on the law itself, that it only is relevant to education programs, right? So that means in order for a Title IX claim to be made, it has to be made against, say, an institution of higher learning, a high school, a middle school, a grade school, some kind of education program. So it does not apply to, say, Fortune 500 companies or private businesses that do not have an educational program. And then finally, those programs have to be receiving some kind of federal funding in order for them to have to comply with Title IX. And if you do a little bit of digging, you find that most colleges in this country, even the private ones, receive some kind of federal funding. And if the college itself doesn't, its students do, right, through federal grants and loans. So pretty much every college and university in this country is having to comply with Title IX because of that federal funding element. All right, so how is Title IX enforced? Well, there are a couple different ways for Title IX to be enforced, and we'll just run through these briefly and then I'll give you a few examples. So a traditional way for a Title IX case to move forward is, a plaintiff files a lawsuit. Very similar to the cases we've been looking at so far this semester. Plaintiff files a Title IX claim against a defendant organization, in this case, probably a school or university, and they go the traditional route and have that case reviewed within the court system. Another way of Title IX being enforced is through an office of the federal government, the Office of Civil Rights, or the OCR, you might see it as. This is an office within the U.S. Department of Education, and their role is really to kind of investigate claims that are made. So someone might make a complaint to them, and they might go in and actually investigate whether or not there is an issue with Title IX. They can also bring cases on behalf of plaintiffs if they choose to. Keep in mind, it's a fairly small office, so they don't really have the resources to do full nationwide compliance, right? They're not consistently monitoring every academic or educational program in order to make sure there's Title IX enforcement. But they can serve that role if they choose to. One other way Title IX is hopefully enforced across the country is through an institutional control. So universities in particular have Title IX offices. In some cases, if it's a large enough university, smaller universities might just have a Title IX coordinator. And their role is really to monitor Title IX compliance, both from a perspective of athletic compliance, but also just overall making sure the university doesn't have any discrimination claims, and also monitoring any claims of sexual violence or harassment, which we'll get into a little bit more later. But that's, one way that especially universities try to minimize the likelihood of having a Title IX complaint against them. So what do damages look like if an educational program is sued for Title IX? Well, there's a couple things that can happen, and often what is being sought by a plaintiff in a Title IX complaint is simply to rectify the situation, right? If a group of female athletes comes together and decides that, they're not being treated fairly or equitably within their athletic department, they might simply sue for there to be a change, right? For the university to fix the situation, to rectify the situation. So that could be one of the damages that occurs. Basically, the judge says, hey, you got to fix this. You're not compliant with Title IX, make some changes. So that could be one thing that happens. Another sort of warning that's been given to academic programs is that they could lose federal funds if they are not compliant with Title IX. I will say I have not seen an incident of this where an academic program, a university in particular, has lost out on federal funds because they've been sued under Title IX. So whether or not that's actually a useful warning, is up for debate. But that's certainly sort of written in the context of the law that could happen if you are not compliant. And finally, there's also the opportunity for sanctions to be laid down, meaning that schools, athletic departments in particular, could lose out on championships, could be vacated. They could lose out on the opportunity to compete in championship events. Those kinds of things that would be sort of a penalty for their non-compliance. On ReggieNet this week, I've shared a recent article here involving a Title IX complaint made by some athletes at Michigan State University. So this is a great example of, a plaintiff-driven lawsuit. So again, we said one of the ways Title IX can be enforced is through plaintiffs filing a lawsuit. This is an instance where a group of athletes have come together and filed a lawsuit against the university for noncompliance. And make sure you read through the article. It's got some really interesting points that the athletes are making about the university's failure to provide opportunities and then their decision to ultimately get rid of some female athletic programs. So it's a good example of what this looks like when a university athletic department is sued under Title IX. Okay, let's talk about how Title IX compliance is proven. And before we talk about the different areas of compliance here, it's important to note that unlike a lot of the legal issues we've looked at this semester, the burden of proof in a Title IX case is actually on the defendant. meaning that the burden of proof is on the defendant university or school to show evidence of their compliance, right? To make their case, showcase that they are actually in compliance with the law. So in terms of how one might go about proving this compliance, basically over time, there's been different interpretations of Title IX in terms of athletic application. And essentially what the courts and what our legislators have come to an agreement on is that there are basically 3 areas in which a defendant would have to show compliance under Title IX. The first of which is participation, so showing that there are equitable opportunities for both male and females. And we'll talk more about that momentarily and how a defendant might go about that. The second piece is financial support, so showing that there are equitable instances of financial support. And, more specifically, this one applies to colleges where there are scholarships involved. And then finally, this third area of compliance is in the actual treatment and benefits provided to participants. So what does that actually look like for the participants that are getting access, right? Do they actually receive the same kind of treatment that their male counterparts receive? So those are the 3 areas of compliance. So if a defendant were sued under Title IX, and the claim is that they are in violation of Title IX, they would have to prove that they are compliant in all 3 of these areas. Now, we are going to spend a little bit more time on the participation piece because this one is probably the most applicable in our field in terms of actually looking at some numbers and trying to determine whether or not an institution is actually providing equitable opportunities. So with participation, what has happened is that the legislators determined that there are 3 different ways in which a defendant sport organization can show that they are providing equitable opportunities to participate in sports. And the reason behind offering 3 different ways to prove this is that, especially early on after the passage of Title IX, I think the courts and the legislators didn't want schools to automatically fail, right? Knowing that there was a pretty big gap in terms of participation as this bill is being passed. So they wanted to give these organizations a lot of different options for being able to show evidence that they're providing equitable opportunities. So they've come up with these 3 different areas. And again, the key thing to remember here is that an institution only has to be able to prove one of these in order to show that they are in fact compliant with the participation area of Title IX. Okay, so we're going to talk through each of these in a lot more detail here over the next few slides. And then your practice case for this week will actually give you an opportunity to apply this 3-part or 3-prong test. Okay, so the first option or avenue for an organization is to prove compliance through substantial proportionality. So what does this mean? Well, by proving compliance through substantial proportionality, the organization is saying that our participation numbers are proportional to our overall enrollment makeup at our institution. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it essentially means that they're comparing how many male and female students are enrolled at their institution to how many male and female participants are participating in athletics. And they're measuring that gap. And ultimately what the courts have determined over time, and you can see some of the instances documented here, that really somewhere below this 5% is really what we would consider to be proportional. Anything above a 5% difference is going to be concerning to the court. And again, you can see that obviously other prior cases have said that, somewhere around a 2% gap is considerable or acceptable, and then a 3 to 5% gap in this 1995 case. Other cases have said things that fall above that are not. So based on this evidence, this case precedent that we have, we really look at this 5% as our threshold for what is acceptable under substantial proportionality. So what does this look like in practice? Let's look at a couple examples. So in order to assess substantial proportionality, we have to compare the overall enrollment at an institution and the breakdown for male and female to the same university's athletic program breakdown by gender. Okay, so I've given you this example here of University X, right? We know that University X has an overall enrollment that is a 50-50 split, right? 50% of their students are male, 50% are female, okay? We also know that University X's athletic program participation is 53% male and 47% female. So that means 53% of their athletes are male, 47% of their athletes are female. So again, what we're looking for here is to have a difference that is at or less than 5%, right? And if we compare the two male numbers and the two female numbers in this case, we see that there is a 3% gap, right, between the overall enrollment and the athletic participation. So that would mean University X is in compliance with the substantial proportionality prong of the test, right, because they're at 3%. So a court would most likely deem this as a reasonable difference between overall enrollment and program participation. Now keep in mind, and I think this is something that is maybe information out there that's not correct, and that programs do not have to have the same number of sports, right? That's not what substantial proportionality is about. Substantial proportionality is looking at your percentage breakdown of participation. It doesn't concern itself with the actual number of sports, right? It's just looking at the overall participation numbers. And in this case, University X would be compliant. All right, let's look at one other example. So this is University Y. We know that University Y has an overall enrollment of 44% male, 56% female. We know that their athletic program makeup is 51% male and 49% female. Again, the numbers that we're comparing here are the gender to gender, right? So the male enrollment compared to the male athletic participation, right? And we see here there is a 7% gap, right? And then the same should be true of our female comparison. 56% enrollment, only 49% athletic program. So same, should always be the same difference here, right, in terms of threshold. And here we've got a 7% gap between the overall enrollment and the athletic program participation. So University Y would not be in compliance with the substantial proportionality test. All right, so substantial proportionality was just one option, right, for institutions to prove their participation compliance. We know there are two other options if they cannot meet the threshold for substantial proportionality. One of them is history and continuing practice. So basically, if using this particular pathway or prong of the three-prong test, an institution would be arguing that they have taken steps and they show a history and continuing practice of actually adding and increasing opportunities for women at their institution. That could look like, they've expanded opportunities for women by adding 3 women's teams over the last decade, right? That would show that they're taking steps to try to even the playing field a little bit, right? And again, one of the reasons for having this particular option is seen especially early on, right? When there is such a gap between male and female participation in this country that, again, the courts wanted to give institutions some time and a chance to get up to speed, right? Knowing that these things couldn't happen overnight, that they would need time. Now, the tricky thing about this option now that we're almost 50 years since the passage of Title IX, is that it starts to get a little tricky to argue that you're still working on it, right? You've had 50 years as an institution to create more opportunities for women, and if you couldn't do that within 50 years, then something's probably wrong, right? That you haven't taken enough steps to provide that level of equitable opportunities. Excuse me. So I think this one in particular is becoming harder and harder to utilize to showcase, that you're meeting that standard. Now, it doesn't mean that it can't be utilized, and it doesn't mean that institutions wouldn't rely on this one to show that they've taken steps to increase opportunities. But just note that I think as time continues on, it's going to become harder and harder to make the case that this is still relevant. All right, the last option for proving compliance in terms of participation is accommodation of interest. So basically, what an institution would do if they are choosing this as a pathway for compliance is essentially show evidence that they are meeting the current needs and desires of the females that are at their institution. Okay? So you might be thinking, how would you go about proving this? Well, there are a couple of different options here. So an institution could survey their students to try to gauge what their interests are, right? Essentially, as students are coming into the institution, maybe as freshmen for a university, maybe just gauging their interests in terms of what sports they're interested in, whether or not they'd be interested in the teams you have, potentially other teams. Those sorts of interest surveys can be really valuable data, right? Because an institution might not be able to show that they have proportional, numbers in terms of that quota, and they might not be able to show they have history and continuing practice of adding opportunities. But it may not matter. They may be able to show that what they offer meets the needs and interests of their students. And that could potentially be enough to prove compliance, right? Because the argument would be, why would we add teams if the students aren't interested in them? So that's one way to measure interest and prove this one. Another option here would be, again, just gathering more data. So maybe monitoring participation rates across the region where your institution is. So maybe looking at what are the trends in high school participation rates? What are the trends in intramural sports activities? That could be another data point that an institution could use to show that their offerings align with sort of the seemingly interest levels for high school students in their region. Okay, so again, when we're looking at proving participation compliance, if you are an institution and you're having to prove this in court, remember, all you need is to be able to prove one of these three. You do not have to be able to prove all three, just one. Again, the courts and the legislators wanted to provide multiple pathways for institutions to be able to prove participation compliance, and these are the three options for that. Okay, so we've covered participation. Now I want to move on to financial support and treatment and benefits, because remember, in the grand scheme of things, a defendant is going to have to be able to prove each of these, right? Prove that they're meeting participation prong, prove that they're meeting financial support and treatment and benefits. So let's talk financial support quickly. I mentioned before that in terms of financial support, this one really applies primarily in a college or university setting. Where you could actually compare the amount of financial support student athletes are getting through scholarship dollars. So this one will look very similar to what we did earlier with substantial proportionality, right? We're essentially comparing the amount of scholarship dollars that are being provided to the student athletes and whether or not that's proportional to the actual number of athletes within that program, okay? So here, if we wanted to assess University X's compliance with financial support, we would want to look at the athletic program breakdown. So here we see that 51% of the athletic program are males and 49% are females, okay? We don't need the actual university enrollment for this one because we're really just comparing athletic participation and scholarship dollars. So we look at scholarship dollars, we see that they distribute their scholarship dollars this way, right? 64% of the dollars are going to their male athletes, while 36% are going to their female athletes. And much like the substantial proportionality prong, here we want these numbers to line up within about a 5% range, right? That's our threshold again. So here, if we're assessing University X, I think we would say this is a big no, right? 51% of their athletic participants are males, but 64% of their scholarship dollars are going to males, much higher than within that 5% window. So given that information, we would say University X is not compliant with that second part of Title IX, the financial support. Okay, the last area of compliance here that would need to be addressed is treatment and benefits. And one, I think, misconception that comes up often with Title IX is this question right here. Does Title IX require equal budgets? If we're saying that there has to be equal treatment and benefits, does that mean that the budgets for all of the female sports have to be the same as the male sports? And the answer to that question is no, okay? Equitable treatment and benefits does not mean that there has to be equal budgets, right? It just means that there has to be equal treatment. And that, for instance, if the football team is getting new uniforms every 5 years at a local high school, then the volleyball team should also be getting new uniforms in a similar period of time, right? And that doesn't mean they're going to cost the same, right? We would probably expect football uniforms to cost a lot more than volleyball uniforms. So it's more about the treatment than it is the cost, right? And keep in mind here, legislators have essentially identified a variety of areas of treatment, right, where essentially an institution can provide equal treatment to both their male and female student athletes. And sorry, this is kind of small to fit on the slide, but we already mentioned equipment and supplies, but there are all of these other areas as well where treatment and benefits can vary, right? So access to facilities for practices and games, how much per diem is being provided, access to resources like academic tutoring, access to quality coaching staff is a big one, so on and so forth. You get the idea here. Basically, all of the resources and support structures that are in place should be equitable, right? So if you're going to market the men's sports in a certain way, you're going to launch a social media campaign and billboard campaigns, those things should be done similarly for the female sports, right? That's another kind of example of these things. So treatment and benefits is an area where we see a lot of kind of fertile ground for lawsuits. I'm going to share this on Regina with you, this case from a couple years ago at Guilford College, where basically there were student athletes and coaches within the university that filed a Title IX claim against the college. And their argument wasn't really having to do with numbers or participation. It had to do with the type of treatment and benefits that were provided. And essentially they argued that the school was providing the male athletes much better equipment and supplies. They were giving them priority for practice times and scheduling games, and just generally across the board, the male athletes were getting better treatment. So we see these types of lawsuits every day, unfortunately. So this is an area where I think there's still a lot of change and growth that is needed. Okay, so just quick wrap up here of Title IX compliance. Again, burden of proof would be on the defendant institution to show or prove that they are compliant with Title IX, and they would need to show that they're providing equitable participation, financial support, and treatment and benefits. Again, all three of these areas have to have a check next to them in order to be able to prove Title IX compliance. But when we're specifically looking at that participation problem, remember they have three different pathways to proving that they're providing equitable participation. All right, we can't talk about Title IX without talking about just this monumental impact it's had in this country. Most of you, and I think all of you, were not around in the 70s. Prior to the passage of Title IX. And you can see from this slide just sort of the impact that this law had on providing opportunities for women in this country. Just the participation numbers alone at the high school level are sort of amazing, right? That prior to Title IX, there were just over 300,000 athletes in the country that were girls. And now we know that's well over 3 million. So, among all of these other massive changes, it's just been a very impactful law that has led to women being able to pursue their passions of playing sport in this country, and certainly continues to have a major impact on student athletes today. One thing that tends to come up in this conversation about sort of all the good that Title IX has done, is this question about whether or not it's been bad for men's sports. Certainly after the passage of Title IX, there were some athletic programs in the country that, rather than take the time and money to add opportunities for women and keep their opportunities for men, many of them took the shortcut, right, of cutting opportunities for men so that they could get to that proportion a little bit faster without actually having to add opportunities for women. And I think it's important to note that the law itself does not recommend this as a method to be compliant with Title IX, and the NCAA actually frowns upon it. So I say that because I think it's important to acknowledge that certainly there have been some men's sports programs that have been cut as a result of Title IX, especially when you look at sports like wrestling, which has seen a pretty significant downturn since the 70s. But I think it's also important to kind of look at the numbers here and look at the data, which is always helpful in telling the story. And you can see that while participation rates for college students and high school students have certainly increased at an amazing rate for females based on where they started prior to Title IX, but those participation rates have also increased for men overall across the country. So I do think it's important to note that while unfortunately some programs have decided to take that shortcut of cutting men's programs instead of adding women's programs, that overall there are more opportunities today for both men and women than there were prior to the passage of Title IX. And this is kind of an interesting aspect of Title IX that really hasn't been a factor until recent years. So some of you might remember this. Back in 2011, the Obama administration, the Department of Education, sent out this letter, which essentially informed lawmakers that sexual violence and sexual harassment are in fact a form of discrimination in a college setting, in a school setting. And this was really the first time, courts were told to view those sorts of instances as a violation under Title IX. Now, a lot has happened and changed since that initial letter went out, but the main focus of that letter was that universities and schools should absolutely look at complaints of sexual violence or sexual harassment and then provide a prompt, thorough, and impartial investigation, right? This idea that if a student is at your institution and they experience sexual violence or sexual harassment, that it is the job of the institution to quickly investigate that and try to get to some kind of conclusion. Like I said, a lot has changed since that initial letter. You can see that within that first 5 years after the letter was released, that OCR office we talked about was investigating literally hundreds of instances of sexual violence or harassment. And the same was happening to a kind of a lesser degree at institutions of K through 12. But a lot was moving there in terms of, Title IX complaints based on sexual violence or harassment. But in September of 2017, the Trump administration's Department of Education rescinded those guidelines for how institutions should, review these cases. So we went for about 3 years there with no real guidelines, which I think was probably a big headache for a lot of Title IX offices across the country. And in May of 2020, they came out with some new guidelines with some changes. I think there were concerns that students who were being accused were not getting proper due process in these cases, so they wanted to make it very clear that even if someone's accused, they should have a level of due process at the universities. So again, all of that to say, we have a new administration now with President Biden, and he has just announced that he is also going to review these. So I hesitate to say too much about these guidelines because they seem to be consistently changing. But the heart of the issue here is that schools under Title IX must investigate these issues of sexual assault and harassment and provide a prompt and thorough investigation. That's the big takeaway. Kind of the minute details that go along with that, like I said, have changed a lot. But the heart of it is that it's on these institutions to do these investigations and protect their students. Probably the biggest example of a Title IX case like this involved Jameis Winston a few years ago. This was the Florida State incident where a female student there accused him of rape. She actually went to the athletic office. Actually, she went to the police first. The athletics department was notified about a month after the incident occurred. And then as you can see here on this timeline, it's another full year and a half before a Title IX coordinator is alerted to the issue, to the complaint. So basically, athletics was notified of this complaint and did nothing. They wanted to keep Winston on the team and keep him playing. If you remember back to this time, this is when Florida State was competing for national championships. So because of that decision, again, this was a massive Title IX infringement, right? Because, again, the idea was schools need to investigate these things promptly, and certainly this was not done in a prompt manner, and ultimately ended up costing the school quite a bit of money that they had to pay in a settlement to that student accuser. So all that to say that, Title IX is, an incredibly important law that has sort of evolved over time to include some of these different elements. And so it's important to know about these nuances and know that it's not the singular law that deals with just athletic participation, although that's certainly an area of interest for us given the nature of recreation and sport. But do know that there are some layers here.